and welcome to the Chez podcast on Paris Underground Radio.
I'm Emily Monaco, fungus expert and professional consumer of cheese.
And I'm your resident wine expert, Caroline Connor.
And we both live in France, where wine and cheese are cornerstones of almost every meal, from the day-to-day to the extraordinary.
At Chez, we feature recipes submitted by home cooks like you and pair them with the perfect wine and the most complimentary cheese.
This week's recipe comes to us from Denise Powers. She's sharing her Zuppa de Farro, or Farro soup, with borlotti beans, spelt, and spices.
My recipe is for farro soup, which is something I like to prepare all winter long. I try to have a little bit on hand all the time. I start making it in late September, early October, and all the way through March. The base is borlotti beans and farro. Borlotti beans are a little bit tricky to find in France, but in the United States, you can get them as cranberry beans. But you can find them in France in like épicerie orientale, like the ones that specialize in foods from the Middle East and other parts of the world. Farro is spelt in English, and it's also, it's épeautre in French. And the kind that they use here in France is a little bit different from the kind that's used in Italy, but just as good. And the combination of the two things is really nice. It also has some nice spices that you don't typically expect in an Italian soup, like cloves and nutmeg and cinnamon. And it has the freshness of, the rosemary and sage, which winters over in Mediterranean climates. So it's really good soup, and I really recommend it.
Thank you so much, Denise, for your wonderful soup recipe. This is a farro soup with beans and pancetta. That basically is like ultimate comfort food.
Totally. I have to admit, I'm usually not that big of a soup fan because I like to be able to chew my food. So this is the kind of soup that I can get behind, where it's like there's chunks of stuff in it. You feel like you're actually eating something, and it's got all these different flavors in it. I am here for this.
Yeah, this is definitely more on the like minestrone side of things with the textures, which is nice. And it does have an Italian vibe, I think. I mean, I guess, yeah, Italian, French. I mean, soup, you throw whatever you got in there and it's the greatest.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, like, there's so much going on here, right? Because you've got like the farro, which has this rich, nutty kind of cereal grainy sweetness, and then you have the pancetta, which has loads of herbs and lots of salt but no smoke. If you're going with like a tradition, like if you're not going to bacon and you're going with either pancetta, or she said in France she uses lardons, you don't have the smokiness of bacon, but you do have also this sort of like cinnamon, clove, nutmeg panoply of baking spices. So you could go a lot of different directions with this and still find something that's going to complement either one or several elements of this recipe.
I mean, this feels very home cooking French style, because the French do love a little pinch of nutmeg,
Mm-hmm.
And that does just give it a little something,
Totally. And I think it's a really interesting opportunity. Often, when I'm thinking of my cheese pairings on this podcast, like I'm thinking of something to come after the main, because that's usually how we eat our cheese in France. But I actually sort of was thinking this could be a fun thing. If you're having your evening meal, maybe you had a big French lunch. Mm-hmm. So this is something actually fun aside for our listeners. The French are super intense about lunch, and this is kind of fading a little bit, but like generally speaking on the weekends, like you have like a big ass lunch that can last hours. Like my first French lunch I got invited to on a Sunday, I had to cancel dinner plans because I was still at lunch at like 7:00. So often if they have these big lunches, then they'll, instead of having a dinner, they'll actually have like a souper, like a supper with an actual bowl of soup. And in France, they're really into their veloutés, so they're like creamy soups. But this one, I feel like it's like the perfect option if you maybe had a bigger lunch, you want something simple and easy and a little bit lighter in the evening. And for me, that means that you could actually have your cheese, instead of having a whole separate course for it, you could have like a hunk of really good sourdough bread, a bit of cheese, and like eat your soup and your bread and your cheese together, which of course appeals to me because I've always been attracted to this idea of hunks of bread and cheese in literature. Like I could totally do the vagabond cheese and bread diet for quite a long time and be very, very happy.
I don't think that's good for your digestive system.
I think you're right. Oh, God, stupid digestion.
just have a salad from time to time. It's funny because I was
Just occasionally.
on this wine trip the last couple of days, and I didn't eat a vegetable for 2 days, and today I can feel it.
Yeah. I did when I came on my second, like I backpacked through Europe twice, and the second time I was like in my early 20s. And I remember at one point, maybe 2 weeks into it, I was like, I can't anymore, because we were like picnicking and we were eating like cheese and bread and salami and stuff. And at one point I went into a grocery store and I bought just like a bag of pre-washed salad and ate like fistfuls of salad for a vegetable.
Yeah, last night when I got home from this trip, I literally looked at my fridge. I had a cabbage. I was like, that's too much effort. But I had some like lettuce that was fine, but like not perky. It's like, okay, I'm gonna stir fry that. So if you ever, and I don't even like salad. Like I think salad is disgusting normally. Like I'll eat it if I have to, and sometimes I like it if there's a lot of other stuff in it. But so I like to stir fry my lettuce with a little bit of soy sauce, and it makes it edible.
Oh wow! And I like salad, but that sounds really good.
It's really good.
So if we're having, and this soup has some fiber in it, so I don't need to worry about my digestion quite so much if I'm pairing it with cheese and bread. But I was thinking, okay, I want a cheese that has enough of its own assertiveness that it won't, fade away with all the flavors of the soup, but I also don't want anything that's going to overpower the soup. And for me, the thing that I decided on is actually a cheese that I recently discovered, which was a smoked crottin de chèvre.
Ooh.
So I found my smoked crottin de chèvre at Quatre Hommes, which is, it means 4 men, but oddly enough, it's actually a woman-run cheese shop here in Paris. And basically she took a crottin de chèvre, which is like the prototypical French goat cheese from the Loire Valley, and smoked it. So it's bright orange on the outside. And it ends up having the same kind of like autumn, winter vibe that you get from like the baking spices in the soup. And it smells like a wood fire. Like it smells phenomenal. And because there's no smoke in the soup, I don't think that it's going to be too overpowering, but it'll still stand on its own 2 feet. You've got this like smoky crust, and then inside you've got like this creamy sort of floral goat cheese aroma that's pretty standard of our goat cheeses here. It's not that super acidic Vermont goat cheese kind of flavor. It's more of like a balanced goatiness. And then even just from a visual standpoint, I think that the bright orange of this cheese, we eat with our eyes first, right? So the bright orange cheese and the like red broth of the soup, I think is going to be a really beautiful kind of vibrant pairing.
We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now back to Chez Toi.
Sounds awesome. I love that. And I love the idea of having it like together. I love the idea of having the cheese on the table with the hunks of bread, with the soup, everything together. Just, keeping it simple and delicious. And in this context, goat cheese is a tough one because often I really would not recommend that with red because the grassiness can kind of be weird. But I think some sort of wonderful Southern French red with a lot of herbaceousness and this character we call garrigue. Garrigue is this really savory herbal aroma that comes from we have garrigue in the Rhone and the Languedoc, and this is like rosemary and sage and lavender and all these wonderful herbs that they have down there, and it really does like get in the wine. So I think I'm going to stick with the Languedoc here and have a red from maybe Corbière or Saint-Chinion. Anywhere in the Languedoc makes really great red blends. And you can get stuff that's really good value. This doesn't feel like a fancy meal. And so again, we want to drink something that is easy but delicious. And I think a nice juicy red would go really well with the soup. And with the cheese, I think it would be interesting to see what a smoked goat cheese would be like with that kind of red. What do you think, Emily? Do you think that would be good?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, like, I have a really soft spot in my heart for wines from the Corbière. I spent a lot of time there, and so I got to know some winemakers and, got to sort of see how they drink their wine as opposed to how it's always so hard, when even with the cheeses, like I'm like, you should do this, you should do that. And when you actually meet the producers of these things, they're like, do what you want. Like they're the least,
do whatever you want.
They're the least like rule followers of all. So like, when I'm meeting people who make blue cheese, for example, and they're like, oh yeah, like whatever, eat it for breakfast, eat it for lunch. I don't care. And when I was meeting these winemakers, you're right, you're in the south of France. You have pretty high alcohol, generally speaking, in the south of France. So it's things that
It's hot.
it's hot out. Exactly. These people, I was just in the Languedoc, and they were like, it literally hasn't rained in a year. Like there has been no rain in a year.
It rained on Monday, so.
It rained when I was down there. So I was like, I brought the rain from Paris. You're welcome.
Yeah.
And so when I was talking with my friends who make these wines from the Corbière, and they tend to have, like you said, these garrigue aromas, they tend to be pretty high in alcohol. And I'm like, oh, so you probably don't want to have these with cheese. And they're like, why the hell not? Like, who cares? So I think it's sort of about, it's also as much about your personal taste as it is about anything else. And I think that's what you and I have been talking about on this here podcast for a long time, which is, you can find things that aren't necessarily going to go that well together. But I think that in terms of a wine and a cheese and a dish, if you like the flavors of all of them, you can find things that will work well. And I think that herbaceousness, the herbaceous quality of the Corbière would probably stand up and have enough of a backbone with all that alcohol to sort of meet that smoke and meet that spice in the soup where they're at. So yeah, I'm into it.
I love it. And again, just like keeping it simple. And these are easy wines to get, easy wines to drink. They're not expensive. And it's just about, people need to chill out. But everyone loves a list. Everyone wants to know what the rules are. So it's a lot harder to educate people about wine when you don't think there are any rules.
It's true. Now, I know you have been thinking a lot about the Languedoc recently, and I'm actually really interested. Languedoc kind of has this like weird, it's almost trying to outgrow this old reputation that it has here in France of like not being as, major scare quotes, as serious a wine region as some of the others. Can you tell me a little bit about that? Like, why is the Languedoc how did it get saddled with such an unfortunate reputation?
I mean, it's all politics and history, and it's legit. There was a lot of bad wine being made in the Languedoc, and there was actually a lot of fake Languedoc wine going into the rest of France. Fake Languedoc wine that was coming from Morocco and Algeria, that was going through the Languedoc basically in the 20th century, in the early 20th century. I mean, phylloxera has a lot to do with it, and also just where it is. In France, we have these two big wine regions that basically have always dominated from a prestige perspective. That's Bordeaux and Burgundy. And we see the story play out similarly in Burgundy, but it's not really relevant to this. The Languedoc can't go anywhere because these wines, before there were trains, before there was actually a canal that went to the Atlantic, they would have to go overland to get to the port at Bordeaux. And guess what? The port at Bordeaux, they don't ship any other wines but Bordeaux. Like, they literally would not export any other wines but Bordeaux. It was the Bordeaux privilege. Like, they literally wouldn't do that. So these wines, even though they were always good, there was almost like no incentive to make great wine either, because, and some people did, of course, some people did, but for most of the producers, most of the growers, they're just trying to live their life, make a little bit of money and survive. So there was no market for great wine from this region. Even though it always had potential, even though it always did make great wine, even though they invented sparkling wine. Don't let the Champenois tell you otherwise. Ooh. Sparkling wine comes from Limoux, where it was invented much earlier than it happened in Champagne. And, it's a region that has just kind of been on the back foot. It also doesn't have any huge cities. Montpellier is the biggest city, and it's not that big. And so it's a big area that's really spread out, that's very, very agricultural, very, very like rugged. So there's a lot of factors that come into it. But what that means for us now is that we're in a moment where the land there isn't that expensive. If you're a young winemaker who wants to do cool stuff, you go to Languedoc. You can buy some vines without like ruining your life, without needing, a castle or any kind of crazy stuff. And most of these wines now, they're organic, they're sustainable, they care a lot about this stuff. And these are people who, it's hot down there already. Like they care a lot about climate change. They are working really hard to do their part to address it. So you see a lot of sustainable farming down there. You see a lot of young winemakers down there. You see a ton of tiny producers. And there's so much quality, and it is insanely good value. I mean, it really is wild how good the wine is and how cheap it can be. I mean, you can get something. I mean, I tasted some wine that was probably in France retail for like 15 euros that was the same kind of flavor profile as like a high-end Napa Cab. A lot of oak, a big, bold red with tons of fruit, tons of tannins, texture, and then that oaky backbone that Americans love. You think about getting a Napa cab of that quality, you'd be at least like $60-$80. And so it's a region, and we also had a white that was also similarly reminded me of that, although I'm not going to say most of the wines taste like that. Some wines are oaked, but a lot of them aren't, and those are also amazing. But there's just a lot going on there. So big fan. Check it out. Be open to all of the AOPs down there and the region in general, because it's magical.
Sold. I am on board.
No, you're already sold. You love it.
Thank you so much, Denise, for sending us this recipe, and check it out at home. Have your supper with your cheese and your big, bold Languedoc wine, and let us know how it goes.
Thank you so much, Denise.
To learn more about the recipe featured today and to see photos of the meal, please go to parisundergroundradio.com.
To have your recipe featured in an upcoming episode of Chez, please email us at parisundergroundradio@gmail.com.
You can find me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Instagram and Twitter.
And you can find me, Caroline Connor, at Wine Dine Caroline on all the things.
This episode was produced by Paris Underground Radio. The music is A Night Alone by Track Tribe.
For more about the Chez podcast and podcasts like it, please go to parisundergroundradio.com.
Thanks for listening, and bon appetit.